Welcome back. Let's spend a minute thinking about the size of deadweight loss. So we said deadweight loss is the loss from the gains from trade if trade is reduced, right? It's the loss of economic surplus from a policy that distorts market outcomes. So we want to think about in which situations is deadweight loss large and in which is it small. So I've set up 4 different diagrams to think about what happens if we have inelastic supply or elastic supply. What about inelastic demand or elastic demand? So take a second, maybe if you need to, pause the video and set these up. Now, as you set them up, let's pay particularly close attention to the slopes of the curves. So for inelastic supply, note that the supply curve is pretty steep. The demand curve, I just drew it in at a 45-degree angle, sort of how we usually draw them in, just our natural drawing in of a demand curve. For elastic supply, note that the supply curve is much flatter. For inelastic demand, I drew the supply curve in at sort of a 45-degree angle, but drew the demand curve in much steeper. And for elastic demand, I drew the supply curve in at its 45-degree angle, and I drew the demand curve in relatively flat, right? Elastic demand, a large response in quantity to a small change in price, is a relatively flat demand curve. So take a second, set them up, and then come back. All right, hopefully you've got your diagrams set up. Now we need to put taxes in these. So this one too is a little bit tricky if we're going to look at the size of the deadweight loss. Ideally, we'd do all this on graph paper, but we don't really have that here. So remember that a tax drives a wedge between what the buyer pays and what the seller receives. So the supply and demand curves are separated by the amount of the tax. Now, if we want to look at deadweight loss, that means we've got to get a tax that is roughly the same size in each one of our diagrams. So look around, see what you've got that you could use as sort of a crude ruler. Maybe it's even just put a couple fingers there and separate the two by that, whatever it is. Maybe it's a ruler if you've got one. Where are they an inch apart? Maybe anything that you can use as a reference. So I've already gone ahead. I cheated and put a couple dots in here earlier to make sure that our tax is the same in each one of the markets. So for each one, we need to drive a wedge between what the buyer pays and what the seller receives. So this wedge, if our tax is the same in each one, this wedge needs to be the same size. That's the key piece, right? This distance between the supply curve and the demand curve needs to be the same in each diagram. So once you've got those in, now we can look at the deadweight loss. So let's shade in our deadweight loss in each one of these. So we're shading in that triangle of deadweight loss. Ooh, big triangle when we have elastic demand. Big triangle with elastic supply. Interesting. We're starting to see a pattern already. So what's the pattern that we see? The triangles, when we have elastic demand or elastic supply, are much larger than when we have inelastic supply and inelastic demand. So over here, these two, our deadweight loss is smaller than on the right, where our deadweight loss is much bigger, right? So these are when we have an elastic side. So we could call this like elastic deadweight loss, and this one is inelastic deadweight loss. Inelastic deadweight loss. All right, so why is there this difference? Well, where does deadweight loss come from again? Deadweight loss comes from the reduction in trade. When there's less trade, there are less gains from trade. So if we've got an inelastic party, that means that the quantity doesn't change very much in response to a change in price. So you don't get a very large quantity response to that tax increasing price. So when we've got an inelastic side, we don't get a very large change in quantity, right? Think about it, we could just draw 1. What happens to that quantity? Yeah, it decreases a little, but not nearly as much as when we have an elastic party, one side that's very sensitive to a change in price. So over here with an elastic demand or elastic supply, you get a big change in quantity, which means you have a large deadweight loss. That's what drives these larger deadweight loss areas. So if you were designing a tax, what would your goal be? Your goal would be to raise tax revenue with as little deadweight loss as possible. So where do you raise tax revenue? Do you raise it on price-sensitive industries, or do you raise it from price-insensitive industries? If your goal is to minimize deadweight loss, you're going to look for areas that have an inelastic supply or an inelastic demand to minimize the deadweight loss of your tax. Hopefully you're getting a feel for why the deadweight loss is smaller when we have an inelastic supply or inelastic demand than when supply and demand are elastic. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.